Hi, Steve. I'm so glad to have you back on the podcast.
Thank you, Vanessa. It's lovely to be here. Really good.
And I'm so excited to talk about your new book, or your book that came out last year, Chaos Monk.
Yeah. I've got it here. Hey, here's the picture. Hey, it's me. It's me on the
Nice.
front as well. Haha, with a Chaos Star halo. So, I'm not claiming sainthood, but it looks quite cool.
It's perfect. Yeah. Why not?
Yeah. Well, it was really interesting. So I'm a great believer that I only write books. Well, for two reasons, really. One is that I really want to write a book, that it's kind of like bubbling up and, it feels like a genuine push to communicate something into the universe. So that's the big one for me. And then the second one is also that I've got a really big question for myself that I would like to try and answer, or at least find the beginnings of an answer to. Um, so Chaos Monk, um, which I think is like the third or fourth book that I've written, kind of came out of some of those questions. Um, yeah, so and when I think back to why these are questions for me, this question about what is monasticism, what does that even mean, and more importantly, perhaps, for me as a contemporary magical practitioner, what could it mean now? Um, So there are these traditional forms of monasticism, but there's also this question for me: what could it mean now? Yeah, so those were some of the big questions that pushed me into doing this.
And I think it came out at the right time, or it probably came out because we had the pandemic and everything, because you start the book by talking about, what are our priorities, and really thinking about like what we really want in life and what really do we want to prioritize. And I feel like that's a huge thing that came out of the COVID period, is like reassessing kind of what's important in our lives and what we really want to hold value on.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think almost inevitably we were kind of stripped back and forced to relinquish a lot of things we didn't want to relinquish either, like relationships, touch with people we were close to, lots of difficult things. But it really did challenge and cause me to reevaluate, and so a friend of mine called this book my COVID baby, and it was like, I think you're right. I think there's a sense um, to that. My own sort of journey with this was when I was studying theology as sort of 19, 20-year old. So I was studying theology, as you know, at a seminary. And one of the potential paths that I was exploring was becoming a Franciscan friar. So becoming like a monk, properly inverted commas, but within like a mainstream church. And while that didn't work out for me, ultimately, for a variety of reasons, it kind of highlighted like an urge in myself. It's part of my makeup, my personality. Um, and we could discuss why, but that sort of introversion and that, I suppose, asceticism to some degree, that's part of probably who I am. Um, yeah, that triggered, as I've kind of come into a more kind of occult, magical way of thinking, those sort of urges and drives and the shape of my personality hasn't entirely gone away.
No, absolutely, and they absolutely go together. It's very interesting to see you merge kind of chaos magic with this monastic lifestyle. And I think we might have talked about it before, but the only time I've been to a proper monastery that was still functional, not like a ruin, was in Big Sur, California. There's a Benedictine monastery there, and it was amazing to be able to stay there. I had ex-boyfriend whose father was had become converted and become a Benedictine monk later in his life, and so we were able to go and like visit him and stay there. And it really is a nice communal lifestyle how they all worked together and did the cooking and the cleaning, and they had a little bookstore. And they got up at like 4 a.m. for
Wow.
vespers and everything, and the church was this like octagonal kind of wooden church that was like, we're in Big Sur, like on this mountain, like in the redwood forest, and because we were up so high on this mountain, you could see like the Milky Way, and the center of the church was like open and had this like big wooden cross hanging down. It was like very simple, but like super elegant. And yeah, it
I
was
think
amazing to be there. I think we stayed there for like 2 weeks.
I know. Is it Benedictine or is it the one that's Carmelades? The one that's do they live as solitaries most of the time? Is that the one? And it's kind of because when you're describing that church, I think I've
Mm.
seen. Do they wear white or do
It's
they wear
right near
black?
Esalen. No,
Yeah.
they were wearing like brown robes, but like light brown, not too dark. They were pretty light.
Okay.
Um, but it's right near Esalen Institute, so I'm sure a lot of psychedelic people end up over there as well.
I think a lot of cool things happen in California, like from the
Yeah.
1950s onwards, and there are these little outposts of intensity. And I think for me, that was part of the when I was trying to boil down what is monasticism or what does the monastic impulse within us perhaps represent, and I was thinking about that drive towards intensity and focus. Um, and I think, I think that's present within formal monastic orders. But those of us who are artists or who are magicians or psychotherapists, we can probably
Or
feel
all three.
or all of those. Yeah. Um, yeah, that's a special level of intensity or
And liking to be
obsession.
left aloneness.
Yeah. And I was also wondering, I don't know what you think about this, about, that kind of classic Jungian, slightly oversimplistic introvert, extrovert, you know, um, dialectic. And that idea of the introvert being someone who has to top up their resources from their internal world through quiet. I don't know. I think that fits to some degree to that sort of monastic drive.
Absolutely. Why don't you talk a little bit about what your journey's been like?
Yeah, okay. Well, I mean, so what in relation to monasticism?
Yeah, or whatever you want.
Yeah, there was definitely a period, as I said, when I was studying theology and I was considering becoming an Anglican or an Episcopal priest, that I was going to become a monk within the Episcopal Church, a Franciscan friar. And I think I was drawn to the kind of radicalism of that, the political radicalism of that sort of vocation, and the radical simplicity and stripping everything back. Um, Now I didn't pursue that. I met my partner, and ironically, she was going to become a nun. Um, and so we used to go to these monasteries together and hang out, and eventually we got together. So the kind of call to celibacy had to go on the back burner, um, thankfully, for a while. And yeah, but there was definitely that urge that I think for me then got directed more into social work. So, I became a social worker, and as you know, I've kind of done that for the last kind of 30 years, as well as psychotherapy. So that desire for my spirituality to mean something in day-to-day life, I think is a really powerful drive for me. And before we started recording, we were talking about bodhisattvas, and the dogs in our life being bodhisattvas. But yeah, you know, that for me, that the bodhisattva within like the Mahayana Buddhist tradition kind of represents that whatever enlightenment I gain, it has to be put to good work, you know, in relationship, and in politics and in economics, all of those things. And if they aren't being put into good use, we might want to question how deep those realizations are. Um, yeah, and so then, you know, for me, I think we talked about before when we had the last podcast, I had a major sort of transition or opening up of my faith, and that involved, you know, the work of Jung, and then getting involved in Gnostic things and magical things. Um, that's probably, you know, over 25 years ago now. And, you know, so that monastic sort of drive, although I was entering into a magical world that superficially might stress things like indulgence, partying, you know, you know, that kind of rich, opulent decadence, and there is that aspect to it, which is really important. But there's this other bit of that dialectic that's about discipline and um, asceticism and arguably masochism, you know, all sorts of interesting things that I felt kind of, especially in the chaos magic world, you know, a lot of my friends who are chaos magicians are really hard partiers. You know, you go to magical meetings and people are kind of like, you know, they like having a good time, and that's fine. But I always felt like the guy who was in the kitchen at parties, you know, where I'd be sitting in the corner with my book, drinking my cup of tea, and that was cool. You know, that was cool. But even in the depths of my kind of magical practice, and however hardcore that became, I didn't want to let go of the true sense of who I needed to be, you know, as a quieter person, as an introvert, as a reflective person. And I think as I've developed my own magical practice, and I think this is reflected in the book, um, I've become increasingly interested in the rediscovery of kind of receptive practices and contemplative practices within the broader kind of pagan tradition. You know, I think we're very good in occult in occulture and in magical communities at being loud and verbal and demonstrative. But the flip side is, you know, where is the receptive? Where is the quiet? Where is the dark? In that sense. So yeah, so part of my own journey, I think, has been trying to recover those things for myself so that my magic felt like a real representation of who I am. And I don't know if it fits for you, but I think as magicians, our magic becomes more real when we can truly become ourselves. You know, there's that really great verse from the Gospel of Thomas, which goes something like, "If we bring which is within us outside, it can save us. But if we do not bring it forth, it will destroy us." So we have to bring out our own reality in order to save ourselves and be ourselves. And if we don't, we risk suppression, repression, all the things that, you know, we might want to avoid.
No, that's a really good point, and especially as people, those of us who become therapists as well, it's like, you know, you're taught to be, you know, so much for the other person and to kind of deny yourself and make yourself as much of a blank screen, you know, as possible. And like a lot, like when I was in psychoanalytic training, like they told us we shouldn't even have a website, like let alone a social media presence. You know, we should be like
Wow.
completely, like if we did, it should just be like our name and address and phone number, like contact information, like no pictures, nothing. Like
Wow.
you have to be like completely like gone. And maybe that's not so healthy for us. Like it's okay to be introverted, but maybe we don't need to be like in complete denial of ourselves. Like we have to have our lives too and live our life too. And that's really what I found, like with the podcast, for example. People ask me all the time, like, oh, how can you be a therapist and have a podcast and talk so openly about things? And it's like, well, I have to be able to be myself too, because I realize at a certain point it's not healthy for me to like completely deny myself. And like, in fact, my whole like development and why I'm such a good listener is because of like my childhood and the way I grew up and how I had to kind of like disappear in order to like be there for the others, so to keep everything kind of calm or whatever. And it's probably a similar experience for a lot of people who end up in this profession. So maybe at a certain point we have to like start centering ourselves, not in our work with our patients, but like in our own lives. That should be okay.
Yeah. I think so. I think first of all, you're right that as therapists, we need to be authentically ourselves, and for that to be visible, because whether we like it or not, our clients, when they meet us, will work out something about us pretty quickly, and often they're coming to us specifically because of what they see.
Hmm.
Oh, you understand this bit. I can tell you understand this bit. And whether it's artistic or spiritual or um, whatever they may or may not know about your history. But I think you're also right about the self-denial thing. There's a real danger for us as therapists and people who follow a monastic path of endlessly denying oneself. And we've talked before, haven't we, about the Satanic Bible and LaVey's radical like ownership of the self and our own needs, and how we need to kind of balance those things off so that we don't become martyrs to therapy, and then find ourselves really resentful or burnt out or compassion fatigued because we're not taking the holidays we need, or setting our limits.
Yeah, exactly. Or taking care of ourselves. And especially like for also artists or magical practitioner or both. It's like for me, I need to have my art out there. I like to make my art and I can't just like hide it away. Like that's not the way art works. So it took me a while though to be able to be comfortable doing that. Or like I had partners before who were like experimental musicians, and I would be on their albums or whatever doing some like spoken word or like playing a typewriter or something like that. And when I became a doctor, got my doctorate, I actually like made them take me off of the music because I was
Oh,
like, oh, I
wow.
can't do that now. I can't be that. I can't have people Googling me and see me on this weird experimental record. I had to actually like, and I had to get in this whole argument with somebody at Discogs where they're like, no, you can't change those things. And I was like, take it off. So like I had to like, I went through that already and I had to become like normal, so that I would be an acceptable professional. And
Yeah.
then at some point, I guess because I got analyzed a few times and I realized like, I can't keep like hiding myself and being this like neutral person in my day-to-day life as well. Like that's not fair, it's not fair to me.
Yeah,
And it
that
does come through with people that you work with, I think, even if they don't know. I think just the fact that you're genuine and being able to be like a bit more self-actualized and being able to be yourself in a genuine way, it helps other people be themselves in a genuine way, even if that's a different way.
Yeah, I think that's spot on. I think it's that journey of like reintegration. I think we can become, especially as you say, like if we gain like a professional status, or yeah, that we can become, this idealized version of the fantasy of what it means to be a therapist or a doctor or a magician or whatever, and it can kind of almost become slightly super egoic, where you like, you're performing it, and then slowly your own stuff will start creeping back in from the unconscious whether you like it or not, and it starts leaking out, and you think either that gets
Thankfully.
either that gets really messy, or if you start waking up to it you go, I need to let this breathe a bit more, and there needs to be more of a connection between these different domains of my life, yeah, it is interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's also a great Jungian concept or point is the concept of individuation. And that doesn't mean you're like individualistic and that you're like all for yourself, but it's just individuation that you learn to like become who you are, like you're in your singularity and your way of thinking and relating to the world instead of just like buying into these ideas of who you should be because you have this position or because you look the way you do, etc. Like really kind of learning to find yourself. That's what he means about individuation. I think that's really important.
Yeah, and I think for me that kind of goes back a little bit to like some of the monastic themes about kind of creating space. I think I say in the book that one of the things that kind of made me think about how does monasticism and chaos magic work together was there's a bit in one of Peter Carroll's books called Liber Chaos, and right in the index there's this little thing talking about a chaos monasticism where for like a certain set period of it may be just a week or it might be a few weeks, you kind of opt for a specific kind of the creation of a specific kind of laboratory in which you intensify your work and you adopt some slightly strange behaviors or patterns of behavior in order to kind of focus some intention. And yeah, I think that for me is one of the benefits of this kind of taking some space, is that it creates, I think, like the magical circle. When like ideally when you're doing like a banishing ritual, what you're trying to do is kind of like create a neutral space into which your intentions and your work can come and create something, but you're trying to almost like clear the decks, kind of all those scripts and messages that we might have picked up in the day, all those projections, all of those things. We're just kind of going, just for a moment, I'm going to clear the decks so that I can work and create. And I think like monasticism and a chaos monasticism is a kind of extended form of that. And I think in the book I talk a bit about like the Abramelin working, which famously Crowley did or didn't do or messed up a couple of times, but there's like that prolonged 6 months, which is an extreme version of practice towards specific aims. And whether, even if we can't do that, because that's completely impractical for our lives, just being able to take some time to kind of challenge where we're at, or to just to, as you say, like to integrate, to individuate. Yeah, it's really important.
Yeah, I think now more than ever with the life of the screens, it's really important to find that kind of space or the shadow side or, get away from the screen for a period of time or not be so performative about what you're doing with magic or whatever, like just online, like have a place for secrets again. Like what happened to secrecy and privacy and these kinds of long-term rituals like you're talking about, like right now we're in Lent, right? So this kind of period where you have like a certain period where you like decide you're not going to do something, abstain for something for this period as you do in Lent, or any sort of kind of ritual period. And I love doing things like that, and you don't necessarily have to be all immersed the entire period because we have to work and do the other things in our lives. But like for example, I have a working I'm doing for this Lent period, and I just like always when I wake up I just have the candle lit at it going all day so that it kind of keeps the focus and energy and keeps your attention on it even when you're going through your kind of day-to-day life.
That sounds great. Yeah, yeah. No, I was talking to someone about Lent the other day. A good friend of mine is a Anglican priest, and I was seeing pictures of her on Instagram, ashing people, and I was talking to one of my sons about whether I practiced anti-Lent because as a recovering Christian, whether I considered it an anti-Lent. But I think those disciplines, we can reclaim them, we can, reappropriate them, and make them more magical or Gnostic, make them our own in quite interesting ways.
Yeah, exactly. I haven't done anything for the Lenten period in a long time, but I have warriors in Santeria, and I'm in Kimbanda Yaya, and my Tata in Kimbanda, he just sends you Lenten issues for the period where you work with these certain kind of entities just for that period. They're not like your normal kind of house cabal. Yeah, and so he just sent them to me, and I was like, oh yeah, maybe I'll do something then, you know.
Yeah.
Why
Yeah,
not?
absolutely. And it's kind of like, yeah, and you can see the parallels between those African traditional religions and saints, within the traditional church, about that we're inviting these energies in a more kind of intense way, into our environment, yeah, to kind of to cheer us on, to encourage us in our work, yeah, it's great.
Yeah, they basically are saints. They're just chthonic saints. They're like underworld saints,
Okay,
which
yeah,
is
yeah, yeah.
fun.
Yeah, there's a great one of my favorite verses, and I think it's in the New Testament in Hebrews. It's like St. Paul is talking about like all the saints that like are in heaven or wherever, who influence our kind of spiritual journey, and he says, we are surrounded by this great cloud of witnesses, and I kind of, as a systemic therapist, I really like that idea that. And I can't remember. I think it was Maya Angelou who went into a job interview, and her friend said to her, why were you so confident going into that interview? And she said, well, it's not just me going into the interview, it's me and all my family and all my ancestors. So there's
Hmm.
that kind of awareness of the potency of all the allies that we can map and capture, in our sphere. Yeah, I really like that idea.
Yeah, that's why I love blood ancestors. Of course, are great. It's great to venerate your blood ancestors, but I also love adopted ancestors, like artists that you're influenced by, or just different people that you've known, or things like that that you can kind of adopt into your own personal pantheon.
Yeah, yeah. I think in one of the things that we do in family therapy, and I don't know if you use this, is the idea of a sculpt. You know, in the history of family therapy, there was a very famous therapist called Virginia Satir, and she was really into the idea of sculpts, where you enact family systems by, you can use it with literal people, moving them around the room, but equally you could do it with artifacts on an altar, or with pebbles or buttons or whatever, and then you pick things to represent things, and then you move them around to kind of represent proximity, but also wishes and hopes, like you want to move something closer, and what does that mean? And in this book, but in the other books I've done, I often get people at the beginning to kind of create an altar as almost like a spell for the book. It's almost like, okay, if you're thinking about heretics, or you're thinking about monastic inspirations, who are you going to have on your personal altar? Are you going to have David Bowie, and and Snoopy, or whoever the people you want to pull in for, um, as your allies, to help you explore a certain question. I think that can be really helpful.
Absolutely. And I love bringing in figures that like David Bowie, that like everybody knows, of William Burroughs. And they're magicians, absolutely. And the world needs to start thinking of them as such.
Hmm. Yeah, yeah, exactly. Yeah, I know Julian Vane, who I work with often. One of the exercises that he does with folks when he's beginning to work with them is to get them to map their allies and inspirations. So often we think about pantheons in very formal, mythic terms, about the Greek pantheon or the Norse pantheon or whatever. But actually, when you look at your personal pantheon of, yeah, your favorite authors, or that film that blew your mind when you were 13, or all of those things, and to represent the sort of energetic influences that have fed into your personality structure.
Absolutely. Carl right now is working on a book that's kind of a magical autobiography of sorts. So they've asked him, it's for inner traditions. They've asked him to kind of go through his whole like magical trajectory, and all the different people he's met and worked with, like LaVey and Kenneth Anger and Jen and everything. And I just read the first draft last week, and it's so good. And there's so many like
Wow.
interesting tidbits he's got through. He's kept a journal as a magical practice like since like 1984 or something, when he like every day. And so he started it as a magical practice because some of these people he like read it was recommended to be able to keep track of your work and what you did and how the outcome was and that kind of thing. And he's just kept it up, so he's been able to go through and like find all these, you remembered all the, like the big points, the big events, but to find all these little details that he had written down of like things like he like being at the last like psychic TV concert that Lady J was at in Stockholm in 2007, and like things that they had talked about and things like that. And he's able to like find all these different kind of conversations and notes and things. And it's been really fun and amazing to read. But one of the things he wrote about in the book, because they wanted to make sure it's not just biography, but also like magical philosophy, is how what he really learned from Anton LaVey was it really is all about culture and the arts and like these kinds of things, because that's what really influences culture at large. And that's what really kind of influences you, yeah, like as a young person, like you said, your favorite authors and musicians that kind of seep in, and then they lead you to other things that they were influenced by, authors they read and things, and it kind of keeps going and going.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that makes sense. And I think I also liked LaVey's idea of what I think he called the total environment, where, as a left-hand path practitioner, you took a radical degree of responsibility for the creation of your own environment. And and I think that goes back to the mapping of influences, like, and kind of, but taking like radical ownership of, yeah, I remember when I was 12 and I found that David Bowie album, Scary Monsters, and it was like, oh my God, something shifted in my psyche that, you know, um, was massive, and kind of embracing that, and thinking about how I could explore that further and what that represented for me, both in terms of sexuality, gender identity, all sorts of things, and great music. Yeah, and you just things you discover about that, like, so when I had a big Gurdjieff period, which I don't seem to have really got out of, but and then I realized that Robert Fripp played on Scary Monsters, and so,
Mm.
and Fripp was a student of J.G. Bennett, and all of that stuff. So it's like, oh yeah, that's really weird, but really interesting how all that stuff has kind of influenced me personally. Yeah.
Yeah, and how they all have connections with each other. No, it is really interesting to see.
Yeah. But I think that total environment can be like a version of monasticism, where we give ourselves permission to take up some space, so that we can, you know, decondition ourselves, which I suppose again is a left-hand path idea about trying to let go of scripts that we might have inherited from our family of origin or our culture that we want to question, or let go of and decondition ourselves. So I think, yeah, it can create that space for that to happen, which I think is similar to the therapy room in some ways. That good therapy, when it's working, it creates that magical circle. And you were talking about therapeutic abstinence. Although I don't use it a lot myself, I can see how the neutrality of that can create a laboratory of sorts.
Yeah, absolutely. Where someone that's actually has this kind of space carved out that you usually don't have, because usually people are really engaging or sharing also or giving advice or trying to help you fix something. or when the analyst or the therapist really steps back and doesn't engage in those kind of normal social relations, it really opens up the space for someone to kind of find their own footing and move in a different way,
Yeah,
not
yeah,
just reacting with the other all the time.
yeah, yeah. And I think it invites, without sounding too grandiose, it invites that, it's like the therapist as psychopomp, kind of helping the client access those bits of their universe that maybe they've lost or have got cut off from. Yeah, so it's like that creation of those rich connections becomes more possible, you know, when that space is used well and creatively.
Absolutely. And that's reminding me a lot of like when I saw Alan Moore talk a few years back. He talked about how all of these how we're like constantly getting more and more divided. All these fields are just like more and more divided into like these smaller and smaller sectors, and how he feels it's really time to kind of start integrating them again. So of course, like the psychopomp, the psychotherapist, developed from the same line. So maybe it's the way to like start bringing things back together a bit more instead of like being so divisive into these like smaller and smaller categories that are like more and more specialized all the time,
Yeah,
looking more integratively at things.
I think I heard a version of that interview, or at least he was sharing similar thoughts on a podcast with Daniel Carter, and he was talking about the Solvay aspect of culture, the breaking apart and the subdivisions. And he said, he felt that we were in the coagular bit where things needed to come back together and sort of unify and inform each other. So yeah, it would be, and yeah, I think, I know Carl's work has really inspired me in many ways, just thinking about that idea of occulture rather than magic being this discrete little weird thing in the corner. It's about art and music and creativity. And I think I was listening to someone talk about William Blake, and they were asking about Blake's idea of kind of gnosis, and they were basically saying for Blake, gnosis and imagination were the same thing, so it was like, the imagination is the Gnostic realm. So if you kind of accept that or you embrace that, then art and creativity and therapy and scientific endeavor and all of the and good cookery, and walking your dog all can become magical activities rather than it being the weird thing you do dressed in black.
Yeah, exactly. Not having to be so separated out. I absolutely believe that. Like, I think it was Jen did a exhibition at the Rubin Museum in New York in 2016 called "Try to Alter Everything," and that they talk about, try to alter everything, not meaning just change it, but also alter it, like make it holy or make it spiritual, and
Mm.
like make. Actually, it was one of my cut ups. I remember that I made around the same time. And I think I integrated it. I like wrote a review of that show of Jen's, but the cut up ended up saying everything is a magical activity, and I was like, whoa, that's so true. It's like, thank you, cut ups. Everything is a
Yeah,
magical activity,
yeah, yeah. No,
or it
that's
can be.
absolutely, yeah. Everything becomes, kind of sacred, you know.
As life should be
Yeah,
if we were all
absolutely.
appreciating it a bit
Yeah.
more.
So it was really interesting, in the book to kind of make those connections between chaos magic and monasticism. And then, one of the things that it talked about was this thing called the new monasticism, which was, this exploration, contemporary exploration of what that could mean, um, through the and in especially through the work of B. Griffiths, who was a Benedictine living in India, who, he brought together quite radically like Christian traditions and Hindu traditions and had them kind of sitting alongside each other and influencing each other. And then his work kind of trickled down and influenced a lot of kind of contemporary, what we might call interspiritual thinking. So yeah, so um, I have talked to some of those people about the book, and they are still a little bit horrified about me, and they kind of see me as some kind of like arch heretic. Um, but that I think that's because of the whole magic thing and the uh, the vibe that perhaps chaos magic gives off, in terms of being a bit more punk rock. But hey, I can live with that.
I can live with it too. And I also loved how you pointed out the left hand path. I never thought of the left hand path in this way as opposed to the right hand path, with the left hand path being like this kind of getting rid of all of these, preconceived notions and kind of breaking things down. Whereas the right hand path is very much like these orders that are like very, for people that don't know, that are very like hierarchical and structural, and you go through these kind of like series of initiations and steps. It's like a very in Lacanian psychoanalysis, like obsessional way of thinking and obsessional way of like viewing the world, and it's very much in line with the way our society kind of is already set up. Like you have to like gain mastery and like go through all of these levels and everything. Whereas like left hand path, I never thought about it that way. It's like breaking that down, getting rid of those kinds of things. I'm definitely on that side. Always have been.
Yeah, and I think that's the thing. I think, like you say, those exoteric kind of right hand path ways of being are often about the early stages of life. Maybe like the first kind of 30-40 years where you're kind of like maybe trying to build your career and do all the things, but often I think in that individuation process there's that radical reevaluation where you kind of go, uh you know this is not my beautiful life. This is
Mm.
you know
How did I get
um
here?
how did I get here? Exactly. And how do I, with whatever time I have left, how am I going to live in a different, more authentic way that kind of embraces what I want? And there are certain individuals, like you mentioned Jen, you mentioned Anton LaVey, who kind of get there really quickly. But even for those of us who've been a bit rebellious for a long time, that there's a richer iteration of that thing, isn't there, where you kind of go, okay, I might have been a rebel when I was 16 or whenever, but what's it like to be an integrated version of that, as I'm in my early 50s or whatever? It's like, what does that mean now? Yeah, I'm really interested in exploring that for myself.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, yeah, Jen never had like a regular job ever. I remember asking her at some point, like, you never even did anything? It's like, nope, like was in the newspaper, like local newspaper at like age 15 for some like little art project that they did, like writing things on pieces of paper and throwing them around the town that they lived in, and like just like leaving them around so people would like
Yeah.
walk by and like pick up these pieces of paper and have like a little phrase or little saying just to like get a reaction out of people. Like that ended up in like the local newspaper. Just like
Yeah.
carried on ever since.
Yeah. Well, I'm not sure what I think about reincarnation, but Jen was definitely coming into the universe with a very specific energy, and lived very true to that for all their life, as far as I can see.
Yeah, it's really true. Really went for it. It was hardcore. Definitely hardcore. And Carl and I was also talking about, and was also kind of a hippie at heart. Yeah, like living in communes and stuff was kind of coming of age at a time where people were doing that. So it was kind of like just like got right into the kind of hippie art commune scene and just yeah, went from there.
Yeah, there was definitely in that work, there was a very, well, as it says on the label, it was a tribe, wasn't it? So it was very relational, um, which is something that I don't naturally go to, but for some people, it's their thing about creating a community and um, inspiring others to consider new ways of living. Yeah, which is very inspiring. Although, you know, as someone who goes running screaming from big communities, I couldn't do it myself. But
But you
I'm
could do
really,
it online, have an online network. Or like I like the Topi rituals that you do on the 23rd of every month and do the sigils. Do the sigils by yourself. You
yeah,
know, they would send them into a headquarters, but it was just really your own personal ritual that you do by yourself. But you know that there's other people out there doing it at the same time as you, but you're not necessarily around them. But you know, also, who
yeah,
knows how consciousness works, like how far consciousness spreads out. I don't know. But
yeah,
anyway,
no,
that kind of power that happens when people are doing a ritual at the same time. Yeah, whether they're together or not.
yeah, yeah, yeah. So so that good example of a collective ritual for introverts.
Yeah, it's perfect. It's perfect for me. I love it. Collective ritual for introverts. And I have to say, it's as what happens when talking with magical people such as yourself, all the things we talked about are kind of things that I've been working on this past couple of days because, well, not only looking through your book again, because I read it originally last year, um, but also like we're putting together our next series of like morbid anatomy events, and the next one that's going to be in April is April 16th, I believe. Someone's talking about total environments. Anders Lundgren, who's is a priest in the Church of Satan, he's talking about total environments through using the film Westworld and the series Westworld, because apparently Anton LaVey really liked the original movie Westworld and this whole idea of this like total environment that people built, and like it was like a theme park where you could
Yeah.
go in and yeah, do the whole thing.
And robots, you know,
Yeah,
you
exactly.
know.
Yeah, I think he called it Westworld total environments, gamification, and ghosts in the machine.
Wow, that sounds like an amazing lecture.
It's
And
gonna be a good one.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And I think that for me as I think I've said, you know, that really connects to both the artist in me and the monastic in me, that idea of creating those creative spaces that allow us just to acknowledge and embrace the truth of who we are and who we want to be in the world. I think that's a really amazing thing.
Yeah, really carving out a space for ourselves. You can do it kind of psychically with like the psychoanalytic session, and you can do it like physically and creating your own kind of physical total environment space, whether it's your entire home or just like a room in your home or in
Yeah,
your cellar or something like that, you know.
yeah. No, that sounds great.
Yeah, and Carl and I are also developing a course for morbid anatomy. That's going to be 4 classes where we're teaching like the magic of the cut up method. So that also fits in with everything,
Mm.
all the data and the burrows and Topi and the whole thing.
Yeah, and again, I think that for me goes back to that very left-hand pathway of understanding our ego. You know, that the ego is something that we work with and embrace, but also cut up. You know, so it's like rather than it being like the standard spiritual thing about relinquishing the ego, um, rather
As if
that
we could.
yeah, as if we could, but rather than that, we work with it consciously to find out what it, you know, its true potential, you know, and invite, you know, chaos and creativity into that process. Yeah, I mean, that's yeah, no, I completely see how that works.
Yeah, no, and definitely, it's like the ego definitely gets in the way sometimes, and you have to like learn to kind of circumvent it. But like, you can't get rid of it altogether because it's the way it's like our interface, you know. It's like then what will we be? Would just be like psychotic or something, or we wouldn't be aware of ourselves. We would like disappear, you know,
Mm.
at least as far as we could tell, I imagine. So yeah, if we want to exist, then we have to have at least a little bit of an ego.
Yeah, and I think for me, you know, one of the big lessons through my own spiritual work has been that we're in a cycle of finding who we are, relinquishing who we are to find who we are again, and so kind of going through that iterative process, you know, of that alchemical process of, you know, discovering the gold, but then returning to the unconscious blackness and new material to turn into gold. So it's that ongoing cycle, which is so valuable.
Yeah, and cycles of creation and destruction, creation and destruction.
Yeah,
Mm.
yeah.
Well, it was so lovely to talk to you. Was there anything else you wanted to mention that we didn't get to?
Well, I just would say, if people are interested in a slightly different way of thinking about chaos magic and more contemplative ways of being, quieter ways of being, more spacious ways of being, check out the book. I know Julian and I are doing a conversation at Treadwell's in May. I'm sure get on the Treadwell's mailing list if you aren't. We'll be talking about chaos magic and kind of contemplation, left-hand path stuff. So yeah, he's interviewing me about some of the themes in my books. So that should be fun. Yeah, so check that out. Also the blog of baphomet.com if you want some free reading and links to all the stuff Julian, myself, and Nikki Weird are doing. Yeah, that's probably about it.
Absolutely. And you should come and do a morbid anatomy event sometime. That would be really fun. Present your work there too.
Okay, well, yeah. Well, we'll have to think about some interesting ideas. That'd be good.
Yeah. All right, perfect.